Hello everyone and welcome to Blender and Cupcakes. In this tutorial series we will be creating a beautiful cupcake scene, right? You can see it right here. And we'll create the entire setup for beginners, right? Beginner friendly, which means we'll start from the very start. To do so you need Blender, of course, right? Go to blender.org. You can go to the download section and get your preferred version. Right now we are in Blender 4.1, which is the latest one, and I'm using the latest one pretty much all the time because I love new features, and we'll be going over some recent features as well. So if you want to follow along, please go and stick to at least 4.0. Alright, in Blender, right, what is going on? Okay, Blender is quite overwhelming. It's an overwhelming software when you start it up the first time, but don't worry. We're going to go slow and steady and go through the list, right? So once you are in Blender, there's a few things you'll see by default, right? You'll see a little cube, the default cube in Blender. You'll see a little light, right? This is a point light, and you have a camera. And the camera is something you use to render, of course. And this is one of your 3D objects. And then you have a light source that is used to add some light to your scene, right? So the three basic things to set up a render are there, right? So a mesh is the object. A mesh is the cube in this case, right? And you can add new meshes, new objects by hitting Shift A on your keyboard, Shift A, and then you have mesh, right? And then you got some mesh primitives. You got cube, circle, whatever. You got a Suzanne as well. I have a few more than you probably have, something you can enable in your settings. But a lot of these you won't really use, right? So we're gonna stick to the primitives, okay? So for this tutorial series, we're going to create a cupcake. And we're going to do this from a reference image, okay? Because visualizing something is harder than taking reference image, especially of something that already exists, right? So we're going to work from a reference image. Then we'll also show you how to recreate something and what to look for and what you can use. So to do so, we can hit Shift A, right? Shift A is basically the hotkey you will use to add everything in Blender, right? So that ranges from meshes to curves to armatures and rigs for characters, images, cameras, force fields. We'll not dive into that yet, but you know, but we can go to image and we can set up a reference image. So click on that, and now locate your image, right? And we'll have there. So by default, this image is going to be added forward to your current viewport, right? Which means right now it is facing us perfectly. But that also means that if we rotate our screen by pressing middle mouse button, that's how you rotate in Blender, you can see it's a little bit, well, at an angle, right? Which is not really nice. So rotating in Blender, middle mouse button, remember that. Panning, shift middle mouse button. Yes, very good. And, well, that's pretty much all we need so far. There we go. So how do we set this object to be more straight, right, on a single axis? Well, it's easy. We can rotate an object by pressing R, right? There we go. And we can rotate in one axis by pressing R, and then the axis that we rotate around, for example, Z, right? And that will lock it to only the Z axis, right? If you want the X, you can press X, and Y, you can press Y. Now in Blender, a green axis, right, the one you can see right here going that direction, the green one is always the y-axis, and you can see it at the top right as well in the gizmo, right? There's a little information about your scene. So you have your axis, green is y, you have red, which is x, and blue is z, and that is always the case. Okay, so you can also rotate with this, by the way, if you like that, or if you are on a laptop. But in general, middle mouse button is preferred in my opinion. Okay. So that's how you rotate. You can also rotate around two axes and exclude the third by pressing R and Shift Z, for example. You will rotate around all the axes except the Z one, I suppose. R, Shift Y will rotate around X and Z. Is a little bit weird. It's better to see with moving objects, which is hotkey G, right? So press G and Y, and you lock it to the Y-axis, G and X, GX to the X-axis, and canceling a movement is just escape, right? Very basic. And that is basically it already, right? And you can press GZ, move it up and down. And if you don't want to move on Z but X instead, you can just now press X and it will lock it to the X, right? You can switch that during your move as well, which is quite nice, right? Well, there we go. Now the other one we need is S to scale your objects, right? S, there we go. It will uniformly scale with pressing S, but you can do the same thing, S and Shift Z, for example. That will scale S, Shift Z scales on all the axes except Z. S, Z scales in the Z direction. S, Y scales in the Y direction. And you can also double press a hotkey in Blender. Yes, that's right. And that means that if we now press G and Z, this is the global axis, right? A global transformation. But we can also locally transform this object, right? So which means that we're going to transform it according to its local axis. And how do you know what the local axis is? Well, if we go to the right panel here in Blender, right, your little menu, you can open and close that with N, by the way. You got all your add-ons and the default little tabs as well. In the item tab, the upmost tab, you got a transform box, right? And you can use this to transform your object as well, right? Just by dragging your sliders. There we go. And if you want to move this with smaller increments, something in Blender, you can hold Shift and drag. And this works for everything that has a slider. Okay, remember that. Sometimes you'll have values that you want to tweak just very slightly, in which case you want to hold Shift. Okay, so Shift and drag in values will use smaller increments. All right, so you can reset this all to 0. Right, you can do a 1 value by just left clicking and pressing 0. You can also change values for multiple ones by left click and holding on the first value and then dragging your mouse down to the other 2 values as well. And then release your left mouse and then you can change them all at the same time, right? Now they are all 1 meter. Beautiful. Ctrl Z, of course, redos a step. Now we can see that the rotation, when we imported this plane, is already set at a random value, right? So this is now changing the local gizmo, the local transformation system of this plane. And you have to see it like this, right? This is how we imported it, pretty much, which means that this up is now, oh, let's draw, there we go. This is now going to be that Z-axis, but it's going to be in the direction of the plane, right? Oh, this direction. Now that is different than the global Z-axis, of course. So if you want to transform an object in its local axis, you can press, for example, G, Z, and Z again, and that will change it to a different Z-axis, right? So the Z-axis in this case is the axis that goes perpendicular to the plane, right? So this one. So I had that wrong, but that's fine. So this axis. And you got G double X is going to move it sideways, right? So in this direction. And then the Y direction, of course, is going to be the third direction that we have there, right? G, Y, Y. It's going to move it that direction, right? So remember that when you rotate your object, sometimes you rotate your cube, for example, and you want to just move it in the up direction of the cube instead of the global direction. So just press G, Z, Z in that case, and it will do the local transformation. All right, remember that it works like a charm. So to get this plane to a more neutral position, we can just set everything to 0, right? So the transformation, the rotation 0, 0, 0, and you can now see we got a nice plane that is, well, normally rotated. But this is not really the direction I like to work in, right? Usually you work from like a front view or a side view more instead of a top view, so I can't always see this reference image. So what I'm going to do is press G, Y, move it away from my cube a little bit, and RX 90. There we go. Right, so that also means, right, you just saw me do it, that if we press R, we can, for example, just type in a value, the degrees that we want to rotate this in, right? R45. That will rotate it in 45 degrees. RX 45, 45 around the X rotation axis. And you can also do this with GZ, for example, moving it one increment to the top, right? 1 meter. GX, right? GX works as well. 5 meters. You can S 0.5 even, right? That's gonna scale it by 2, right? By a half. I mean, it's gonna scale it down by 2. So you can type in pretty much whatever you want, and once you get really comfortable with that, right, it's gonna work incredibly fast because you can select objects, S2, scale it up, RX 45, and so on, right? You can really move things quickly. So how do you start the modeling process? Well, by default, I try to think about the objects that I'm gonna model as they will be created in real life as well. Okay, because that's usually the easiest way to start off. Which means, for example, right here, we would not start top to bottom, but we will start bottom to top, right? Because you cannot just add a raspberry, add the foam underneath, then add the cupcake underneath, right? We want to add the foundation of the cupcake first, which is the actual cupcake shape. Then add the layer of liquid, then add that layer of soft foam part, and then add another liquid, and then add the raspberry on top. Okay, so that's exactly the order that I'm going to be creating this in as well, right? Simply because that is a natural order to follow, and it's easier to model things on top of objects than on the bottom, right? That's just my preference. So, how do we start this off? Well, you can probably already tell that a cupcake's default shape is a circle. So we're going to start off Shift A, mesh with a circle. Okay. And a circle will add a menu on the left bottom. And we can decide how many vertices we want there for our circle. Now I'm going to set this at 8 because, like I said, we're going to work with subdivisions, which means we're going to add resolution to this later. Set this to be about 8. There we go. So now we go like a, what's it called? Octa something. I don't know. So in edit mode, we have vertices, right? What I just explained, vertices right there. We have edges, which is this line, and we have faces, right? Right now we don't have a face, but later on we're going to fill up this bottom section to be a face, right? But right now we're going to extrude this, and I'm going to go to edge select mode by pressing 2. 1 is going to be vertex select, 2 edge select, and 3 face select. So remember these, 1, 2, 3, you can just, you know, hover between the 3. Go to 2 and press A to select everything. Press E, and just like we did when we moved objects, we can lock the extrusion to a single axis, for example, Z. Right, so now it's moving only up. There we go, something like that. And we can press S to scale this up a little bit, right? Create a bit of that sloped shape of our cupcake. Beautiful. So, how do we now turn this into more of a shape like this? Alright, the cupcake top, there we go. That required a lot of focus. And it still looks like garbage, but it's fine. You know what I mean? Well, we can just press E once again. Lock it to Z by pressing Z. Left click to apply. And scale this up a little bit like that. Beautiful. Now we can press E, Z once again. Like that. And then we can press E, Z. Like that, and scale it down, for example, like that. Beautiful. So that is pretty much the OG shape of the cupcake, right? We may change it a little bit later, but by default, this is about the shape, okay? So how do we fill this up now, okay? So you have multiple ways of filling up edge loops, all right? The basic one is F to fill. But now, again, we get an n-gon that is going to mess up our subdivisions. What do we do? Well, we can either manually fill this up by, for example, extruding our edges, right, and connecting it like this, selecting 4 vertices and pressing F, it's going to connect it up. Or we can cheat it a little bit, select our edge loop by double clicking, or sometimes it may be alt left clicking, depends on your settings. Left click, left double click is it for me. We can then press F3 to look for a function, and we can now find grid fill. And a grid fill is always going to look for a way to fill up the edge loop you selected with quads, okay? Which is perfect. Now it will not always work though. So when your edge loop contains an amount of vertices that is impossible to fill up with quads, it will not work, right? Which also means that if you would do that by hand, it would get very tricky to fill up as well. So it is a good first check on how well your shape, your edge loop can be filled up. So then just enter, and you can see it is now filled up with quads, all right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Beautiful. Now we can do the same thing for the bottom, right? Remember, select your edge loop by pressing 2 to go to edge select, double clicking or alt clicking. F3, grid fill. There we go. Beautiful. So let's see what happens if we go back to object mode by pressing tab and adding a modifier, right? It's in the gear, or what is it called? The section right there with the blue tool icon, whatever it is, wrench, I believe. We can now hit add modifier, search, subdivision modifier. You can see this is looking way better. The shape is looking much smoother. We're not getting weird shading. We're not getting artifacts, stuff like that. So this is quite perfect. All right. So this may, however, be a bit too smooth. Okay. Because the bottom is too smooth, we wanted to keep it more straight. All right. So there's 2 ways to do that in Blender. All right. There's 2 ways to straighten up an edge. So you can select your entire edge. This time we need to just go around, hold shift, double click your edges or alt click, make sure everything is selected. We can hit shift E, which is going to sharpen pretty much our object, but it has a little bit of less control over how it is going to happen, right? You can see it's a bit odd perhaps, but we can also, for example, bevel this edge, and a bevel is going to be added to create a nice slope on your edge, right? So let's say we have an edge here and we want this to be smoother. We can add a bevel, right? And we can add a bevel with multiple segments as well. So it's going to be smoother. And that depends on how many segments you will add. All right, so let me show you. With the edge selected, press Ctrl B for bevel and drag your mouse up a little bit, right? So the farther you drag this up, the stronger your bevel will be. But we can just crank this down to be something like that, for example. Something that looks good, okay? Like that. And now we have a bevel like that. Now, of course, it's going to be smoothened out with the subdivision modifier, but it's going to be a nicer angle, more controlled, right? And now you can still change the bevel right here at the menu. And you can increase, for example, the amount of segments, right? To make that a bit smoother. There we go. All right, so let's set this to 2, for example. That looks quite smooth to me. Beautiful. And the shape we can change as well, right? So how we want this to be. Do we want this to be outwards? Do we want this to be inwards? Right, so there we go. That's already looking quite beautiful. Now the top of our cupcake may be a little bit too thick though, a little bit too too high. So we can just move that down. And we can do this easily by using something called proportional editing, right? Because I don't just want to move this single faces down because it's gonna look weird. I want to move the entire top part down a little bit. So to do that, we can press O on our keyboard. O, proportional edit. I don't know, think of it like that, just many O's in a word. It means O, proportional edit. Beautiful. And now when we press G and lock it to Z, we have a little circle appearing on our screen, and that is the fall off of the movement of the faces we selected, right? So everything around the selection will now be moved with this selection as well, and the strength of which it will move with it is based on that circle, which is the fall off, right? So we can scroll up and down to change the fall off of our movement, right? So if I make this very small, it will only move that top edge or top face selection. But if I scroll this up to be bigger, I'm going to move that entire top part of our cupcake. And if I scroll it even bigger, it's going to move the entire thing, right? So that is something incredibly useful. Something like that. Beautiful. And we can do the same thing with scaling this down a little bit, perhaps, right? Scroll down a little bit. Just make sure to get that beautiful shape, right? Move this down a little bit, perhaps, like that. Try to get as close to the reference image as you can, all right? Now, I want a little bit of a sharper shape here at the middle. So let's press 2 and double click on these edges. And we can now press Shift E to sharpen this up a little bit. Or we can do the same thing we did before, Ctrl B, right? And then scroll up and down. I'm gonna just add one subdivision. Just make it nice and sharp. There we go. Quite beautiful. Now, to make this all smooth, we can press right mouse and hit Shade Smooth. There we go. A foundation for a cupcake. Isn't that beautiful? Now, if you want more detail, if you don't want these hard edges here and here and here and here, you can up the level of a subdivisions to 2. Right? Oh, it's so smooth. Now you have a viewport and a render subdivision count. Usually this is by default set to 1 and 2. So in your viewport it's going to be working at 1, but as soon as you render it out, it's going to add a level of detail in your mesh. Okay. For this reason, we're just going to make a cupcake. It's not going to be that strong or performance dependent. So I'm just going to set my viewport to 2 as well, so it matches with our final render. That has been part 1. Thank you so much for watching. And this one, it was also about getting some information out there on how to do certain things and why we're doing certain things as well. The approach on how to do this. But we'll pick up the pace a little bit as more information is getting out there. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like, a comment, subscribe, enjoy any one of those. And then I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.